Could you be walking down a moral staircase without even realizing it? I've often wondered about this question while watching news stories about corporate scandals, political corruption, or personal falls from grace. The people involved rarely set out to commit major ethical violations. Instead, they traveled a path of small compromises that gradually led them somewhere they never intended to go. The concept of the slippery slope describes how minor ethical compromises pave the way for larger ones. Each small step down this moral staircase makes the next step easier and more likely. The metaphor suggests a gradual descent rather than a sudden fall, a process where people who consider themselves good can eventually participate in actions they would have once found unthinkable. I interviewed a former accountant who served time for financial fraud. He began with temporary adjustments to quarterly numbers, planning to fix them later. When conditions worsened, the adjustments grew larger. Within 3 years, he was falsifying major financial documents with no clear path to return to honest practices. This story illustrates a key insight from psychological research. Moral disengagement happens gradually. People don't transform from ethical to unethical overnight. They disconnect from their moral standards incrementally, through steps that individually seem minor, but collectively lead to significant ethical breaches. When we make that first small ethical violation, it creates psychological tension called cognitive dissonance. Our actions conflict with our self-image as moral people. This uncomfortable mental state demands resolution. Either change our behavior to align with our values, or change our thinking to justify our behavior. Unfortunately, we often choose the latter path. A manager uncomfortable about withholding information from customers might rationalize, "Everyone in the industry does this," or "Customers wouldn't understand the technical details." These justifications don't merely excuse the current action. They establish groundwork for larger deceptions later, expanding the zone of acceptable behavior. This process exploits our brain's adaptability. Just as our senses adjust to new conditions, like a noisy room eventually seeming quieter, our moral senses recalibrate based on recent behavior. After several small ethical compromises, actions that would have once triggered internal alarm bells begin to feel routine. Marketers and compliance professionals leverage this psychology through foot-in-the-door techniques. This persuasion strategy starts with a small request followed by increasingly larger ones. A classic study demonstrated this effect by first asking homeowners to place a small card supporting safe driving in their window. 2 weeks later, different researchers asked the same homeowners to install a large, unattractive billboard with the same message. Those who agreed to the small card were significantly more likely to accept the intrusive billboard. They had psychologically committed through that initial small step, creating a pattern of compliance that made larger requests seem reasonable. Our moral self-image shows remarkable flexibility in accommodating increasingly problematic behavior. We don't abandon our ethical self-perception. We modify our definition of ethical behavior instead. We reframe questionable actions through several mechanisms, minimizing consequences. No one was really harmed, dismissing victims, they should have known better, diffusing responsibility. I was just following procedure, and appealing to higher loyalties. I did it for my family. The business world demonstrates this pattern repeatedly. Enron began with aggressive accounting that gradually evolved into outright deception. Employees who initially expressed concerns became active participants as their ethical thresholds adjusted over time. Political corruption follows similar patterns. Officials rarely begin taking large bribes. The path starts with small favors or minor conflicts of interest. Each violation recalibrates what feels permissible until shocking behavior becomes standard practice. Personal moral decline operates on these same principles. Betrayal of trust typically begins with minor boundary violations, flirtatious conversations, small secrets, or inappropriate thoughts. Each step prepares the ground for the next, larger violation. What makes this particularly dangerous is that organizations can deliberately create these moral staircases to normalize unethical behavior. Military training systematically desensitizes soldiers to violence through graduated exposure. Corporate cultures can incrementally normalize cutting corners through aggressive targets and implicit pressure to do whatever it takes. Ethical fading, where moral dimensions of decisions gradually disappear, often results from organizational framing. When decisions are presented through technical, financial, or efficiency lenses, ethical considerations fade into the background. People focus on meeting goals rather than considering the moral implications of their methods. A former corporate executive told me, "We discussed aggressive tax strategies and competitive market practices. The language made it impossible to see we were crossing lines. The pressure to meet quarterly targets overwhelmed everything else." Small ethical compromises lead to major moral violations through incremental disengagement, where each step makes the next easier and cognitive dissonance drives justification rather than correction. This process operates through normal psychology, our need for consistency, adaptive moral sensibilities, and capacity for self-justification. This understanding connects directly to Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. After observing Nazi official Adolf Eichmann's trial, Arendt was struck by his ordinariness. He appeared not as a sadistic villain, but as a bureaucrat who had descended a gradual staircase of moral compromise until unimaginable acts became simply part of his job description. What makes this concept so significant is that it shifts our understanding of evil from exceptional monsters to ordinary processes that can affect anyone. The danger isn't just that bad people do bad things, but that normal psychological mechanisms can lead ordinary people down paths where evil becomes routine, where atrocity transforms from unthinkable to simply part of one's daily responsibilities. This is where we turn next, to understand how evil becomes banal, routine, and bureaucratic in ways that disguise its true nature even from those participating in it. The banality of evil, when atrocity becomes routine. What happens when committing evil becomes just another day at the office? This question haunted philosopher Hannah Arendt as she sat in a Jerusalem courtroom in 1961, watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann. As a Nazi SS officer, Eichmann had orchestrated the transportation of millions of Jewish people to death camps. Given the scale of his crimes, Arendt expected to see a monster, someone visibly marked by the enormity of his evil. Instead, she encountered something far more disturbing, a balding, middle-aged bureaucrat who spoke in clichés and seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone would question his actions. Eichmann didn't present as a sadistic villain. He insisted he had no personal hatred toward Jewish people and spoke without ideological fervor. He appeared, in Arendt's words, terribly and terrifyingly normal. This stark contrast between the magnitude of his crimes and his ordinary demeanor led Arendt to formulate one of the most important psychological insights of the 20th century, the concept of the banality of evil. This psychological mechanism operates in many contexts where significant harm occurs. Evil can emerge through ordinary people performing routine tasks within systems where harmful outcomes have been normalized. Eichmann saw himself not as a mass murderer, but as a transportation logistics expert efficiently solving complex problems, taking pride in his organizational abilities and attention to detail. I've thought about Arendt's concept while interviewing workers in various institutional settings, from immigration detention facilities to pharmaceutical companies that priced life-saving medications beyond reach for many patients. Almost none described themselves as causing harm. They saw themselves as professionals doing their jobs according to established protocols. The psychological distance between their daily activities and the ultimate effects allowed them to maintain positive self-images while participating in systems that caused suffering. Systems that produce harmful outcomes develop sophisticated mechanisms to separate actions from their consequences. Bureaucratic procedures create layers between decisions and their impacts. Complex chains of command diffuse responsibility, so no single person feels accountable for the final result. Technical language transforms ethical questions into procedural ones. The Nazi bureaucracy exemplified these distancing techniques. The final solution became an administrative problem rather than a moral atrocity. Meetings focused on transportation logistics, cost efficiency, and processing capacity, not the human lives being destroyed. When Eichmann visited Auschwitz, he later recalled being disturbed by the sight of gassing victims. Not because of moral horror, but because the messiness contrasted with the clean administrative process he had helped design. Many people maintain separate ethical standards for their work self versus their home self. A manager who would never lie to friends might routinely mislead customers because that's just business. A kind-hearted person who donates to charity might implement harmful policies because those are the regulations. Research shows how easily this compartmentalization occurs. When people enter professional roles, they often adopt different ethical frameworks than they use in personal contexts. They prioritize loyalty to the organization, conformity to professional norms, and technical excellence over broader moral considerations. This shift isn't experienced as moral compromise, but as appropriate professional behavior. Bureaucratic language reinforces this compartmentalization by masking human implications. People become cases or applicants. Harmful outcomes become negative externalities. Deaths become casualties. This language fundamentally reshapes how people think about their actions by focusing attention on technical rather than moral dimensions. I interviewed a claims adjuster who regularly denied medical coverage based on technicalities. When asked how he felt about people potentially suffering because of his decisions, he seemed genuinely confused. "I don't make medical decisions," he explained. "I apply coverage criteria to submitted documentation." The bureaucratic framing had completely overtaken his perspective. These dynamics play out in contemporary institutions around us. Insurance companies deny life-saving treatments through routine processing. Government agencies separate families through standard immigration procedures. Corporations damage communities through normal business operations, justified by fiduciary responsibility. Harm results from ordinary people following established protocols while focusing on narrow technical concerns rather than broader ethical implications. The division of labor within organizations amplifies this effect by fragmenting responsibility. When each person handles just one small part of a process, moral awareness diminishes. The software engineer designing a small feature doesn't see how it fits into a discriminatory algorithm. The loan officer processing one application doesn't perceive systemic bias. The customer service representative following the script doesn't recognize exploitation. A former tech worker who helped design engagement metrics for a social media platform later discovered how these metrics had incentivized divisive content and contributed to polarization. "I was just optimizing for user attention," he told me. No one talked about the social implications. We were focused on solving technical problems, not thinking about ethics. Arendt recognized that evil becomes most dangerous when transformed into routine processes carried out by ordinary people focused on efficiency rather than ethics. The greatest moral threat isn't the obvious villain, but systems that transform harmful outcomes into administrative procedures, carried out by people who never see themselves as doing anything wrong because they're simply performing their roles competently. This insight changes how we think about preventing harm. If the greatest harms often result from ordinary people performing routine functions within problematic systems, then our focus must shift to the systems themselves, to the structures, incentives, language, and procedures that enable normal people to participate in harmful outcomes without experiencing moral conflict. These mechanisms converge with particular clarity in historical atrocities, where ordinary citizens became participants in extraordinary harm. The psychological distance created by bureaucracy, the compartmentalization of identity, the technical focus that obscures moral dimensions, the fragmentation of responsibility. These factors combine to enable mass participation in systems of harm.